December 16, 1944. A 90mm anti-aircraft gun crew from the 406th Artillery Group crouches in the frozen mud near Monschau, Germany, watching shadows move through the morning mist. Sergeant Robert Mitchell's breath forms white clouds as he loads a shell into the breech, its nose painted with a mysterious red band that marks it as different from every other round he's fired in 2 years of war. "What's so special about these?" asks Private James Kowalski, the loader, running his gloved hand over the distinctive marking. "Classified," Mitchell replies, though he doesn't fully understand it himself. "Just got them yesterday. Orders say use them only in emergency." The emergency arrives at 05:30. Through the pre-dawn darkness comes the rumble of engines, hundreds of them, as German armour pours through the Ardennes forest. The massive offensive that will become known as the Battle of the Bulge has begun, and lightly armed American cavalry troopers at Monschau are directly in its path. Colonel George Axelson faces an impossible choice. These new shells, delivered just 48 hours earlier, carry restrictions from Supreme Headquarters itself. General Eisenhower hasn't authorized their combat use. But American soldiers are dying, and Axelson has a weapon that might save them. At 0600, he makes his decision. The restrictions be damned. Fire. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. Mitchell chambers the red-banded shell, sets the mechanical fuse for 1,500 feet, and pulls the firing lanyard. The projectile screams upward into the grey winter sky. At precisely 1,500 feet, something impossible happens. The shell explodes without hitting anything, detonating in mid-air exactly where American gunners aimed it. Shrapnel rains down on German soldiers advancing through an open field. Men who thought themselves safe from artillery fire, protected by the bad weather that prevented aerial observation, fall in windrows. In 5 minutes of firing, Mitchell's crew expends 23 rounds. 23 perfectly timed airbursts that slaughter German infantry caught in the open. The advance at Monschau stops cold. German commanders, completely unprepared for this new type of artillery fire, pull their units back to reassess. They have just encountered the proximity fuse, the most closely guarded technological secret of the Second World War, a weapon whose development cost the United States more money than the Manhattan Project, and whose deployment the Pentagon had forbidden for fear that a single captured shell would hand Germany a war-winning technology. What those German officers couldn't know, was that they had already lost a race they never realized they were running. This story isn't about the proximity fuse itself. That tale has been told. This is the story of why it took so long to use it, what that delay cost, how it transformed anti-aircraft warfare overnight, and why the German Luftwaffe, once the terror of European skies, found itself suddenly and catastrophically outmatched by a technology their own scientists had concluded was impossible to build. The mathematics of shooting at aircraft had frustrated gunners since the First World War. A shell fired from the ground takes time to reach altitude. An aircraft travels horizontally during that time. By the time the shell reaches the aircraft's altitude, the plane has moved. Gunners compensate by using mechanical predictors that calculate where the aircraft will be when the shell arrives. Set the fuse to detonate at that altitude, fire, and hope the calculations are correct. The problem is that hope rarely translates to hits. Pre-war estimates suggested that destroying a single aircraft required between 2,000 and 4,000 rounds of anti-aircraft fire. The Battle of Britain validated those estimates. During 1940, RAF fighters shot down one German aircraft for every 200 to 300 rounds expended. Anti-aircraft guns required between 3,000 and 5,000 rounds per kill. The disparity was staggering. A direct hit on a fast-moving aircraft at altitude is nearly impossible. Even skilled gunners firing with perfect mechanical predictors achieve hit rates measured in fractions of a percent. But aircraft don't require direct hits to suffer fatal damage. An explosive shell detonating within 30 to 50 yards of an aircraft will shred control surfaces, puncture fuel tanks, and kill crew members with shrapnel. The challenge is getting the shell to explode at exactly the right altitude at exactly the right moment. Mechanical time fuses, the standard technology from 1939 through 1943, work by starting a small clock mechanism. When the shell is fired, the clock ticks down for a predetermined time, then triggers the detonator. Setting these fuses requires complex calculations. Gunners must estimate the target aircraft's altitude, speed, and flight path. Fire control computers process this information and tell crews what time setting to dial into the fuse before loading the shell. If any variable is wrong, if the aircraft changes speed or altitude, if the atmospheric conditions differ from assumptions, the shell explodes harmlessly above or below the target. The USS Helena, a light cruiser in the South Pacific, demonstrated the problem's severity during early 1943. On the morning of January 5th, Japanese Aichi D-3, a dive bomber's obsolete aircraft with a maximum speed of 240 miles per hour attacked her task force off Guadalcanal. Helena's anti-aircraft battery, 12 5-inch guns plus numerous smaller weapons, opened fire with conventional time-fused shells. The Japanese aircraft dove, released their bombs, and pulled out. Helena's guns fired salvo after salvo. Shells exploded around the attacking aircraft, creating walls of black smoke as the time fuses detonated at their preset altitudes. The Japanese aircraft flew through the explosions and escaped. One scored a direct hit on the New Zealand cruiser Achilles before departing. Helena had fired dozens of shells, achieved perfect fire control, placed her explosions exactly where her predictors calculated the aircraft would be, and the Japanese still survived. As the dive bombers flew off toward their base, Helena's gunners fired a final, frustrated salvo. 2 shells, almost as an afterthought, 2 shells that weren't like the others. 2 shells with mysterious fuses that had been installed just days earlier. Both shells exploded, not when their time fuses said to explode, not at a preset altitude. Both shells exploded when they approached within 75 yards of the retreating Japanese aircraft. The Aichi burst into flames and fell into the Pacific. Helena's crew watched in stunned silence as wreckage scattered across the waves. They had just witnessed combat history, the first enemy aircraft deliberately destroyed by a proximity fuse, the first kill achieved not by hitting the target, but by detecting it. The physics underlying proximity fuses had been understood for years. In theory, a small radio transmitter in a shell's nose could broadcast a continuous signal. That signal would reflect off nearby objects, particularly large metal ones like aircraft. A receiver in the fuse would detect the reflected signal. When the reflection reached sufficient strength, indicating the shell had approached within lethal range, the receiver would trigger the detonator. In theory, this was straightforward. In practice, building it required solving dozens of seemingly impossible engineering challenges. The entire system had to fit inside a shell nose just 6 inches long and 3 inches in diameter. It had to include a miniature radio transmitter, a receiver, an amplifier, a battery, and a firing mechanism. Every component had to survive being fired from a gun, an event that subjected the fuse to acceleration forces exceeding 20,000 times the force of gravity. The shell's journey through the rifled barrel set it spinning at 25,000 revolutions per minute. The components had to function in that environment. They had to work at altitudes where temperatures dropped to -40 degrees Fahrenheit and atmospheric pressure fell to half that at sea level. Most challenging of all, they had to work reliably. A premature detonation would kill the gun crew. A failure to detonate wasted precious ammunition and, worse, gave the enemy an intact fuse to study and copy. The reliability requirement exceeded 90%. Building electronic systems to those specifications in 1940 would have been difficult in a laboratory setting. Building them for mass production, millions of units, cheap enough to be expendable, seemed impossible. British scientists had concluded it was impossible. They focused instead on photoelectric fuses that used light sensors to detect aircraft. German scientists reached the same conclusion. More than 30 different German proximity fuse projects, some using radio frequencies, some using acoustic detection, some using electrostatic fields, progressed through various stages of research and development. None reached production. German engineers decided the acceleration forces and spinning would destroy any electronics small enough to fit in a shell. The idea was abandoned as impractical. American scientists, working under Dr. Merle Tuve at the Applied Physics Laboratory of Johns Hopkins University, refused to accept that conclusion. They started with the hardest problem first, the battery. Conventional batteries of 1940 were too large, too heavy, and couldn't survive the firing shock. National Carbon developed a revolutionary design, a reserve battery no larger than a fountain pen. Inside a sealed glass tube, electrolyte solution sat separated from metal plates. When the shell fired, the acceleration forces shattered the glass tube. Centrifugal force from the shell's rotation spread the electrolyte across the metal plates. Chemical reaction generated electrical current. The battery activated itself through the firing process. The transmitter required vacuum tubes, the electronic components of the era. But standard vacuum tubes were fragile glass envelopes containing delicate filaments. They shattered under even modest acceleration. Sylvania Electric developed ruggedized tubes with reinforced envelopes and special filament designs that could survive the gun firing. These tubes were smaller than any previously manufactured, yet still functional. The transmitter broadcast at frequencies between 180 and 220 MHz, using the shell body itself as an antenna. The receiver picked up reflections from the transmitted signal. When a large metal object like an aircraft appeared nearby, the reflection strength increased dramatically. The receiver fed this signal to a trigger circuit incorporating a thyrotron tube, which fired when signal strength exceeded a threshold. The trigger closed a firing circuit, sending current to a small primer charge that detonated the shell's main explosive. From detection to detonation took milliseconds. Safety features were critical. The fuse couldn't arm until the shell was well clear of the gun. A mechanical setback switch, held open by a spring, closed only when subjected to the acceleration of firing. The battery required several seconds of centrifugal force to activate. A clockwork timer prevented detonation for the first second of flight, ensuring the shell traveled hundreds of yards from the gun. If the fuse failed to detonate in flight, a self-destruct mechanism triggered after 45 seconds, preventing intact fuses from falling into enemy hands. By summer of 1942, after nearly 2 years of development work, Tuve's team had a working prototype, designated the Mark 32 fuse for the Navy's 5-inch 38 caliber gun. The USS Cleveland conducted live-fire tests in Chesapeake Bay during August. The results exceeded all expectations. Gunners fired at remote-controlled target drones. The proximity-fused shells detonated when they approached within the effective lethal radius of their shrapnel. Hit rates increased by a factor of 3 compared to time-fused ammunition. Under identical conditions, time fuses required an average of 1,000 shells to destroy a target. Proximity fuses required 300. The Navy immediately authorized mass production. 5 companies, Crosley, RCA, Eastman Kodak, McQuay Norris, and Sylvania, began manufacturing fuses and components. More than 2,000 suppliers provided raw materials. Initial production rates were modest. The first factories produced just 500 fuses per day. But American industrial capacity, once mobilized, was overwhelming. By late 1943, daily production exceeded 40,000 fuses. By war's end, the number reached 70,000 per day. Total wartime production exceeded 22 million fuses, at a total cost exceeding $1 billion, roughly $15 billion in modern currency. The Navy deployed proximity fuses immediately upon production. The weapon's value in protecting the fleet from air attack was so obvious that operational security concerns were overridden. Helena's kill in January 1943 was followed by increasingly widespread use throughout the Pacific. During 1943, U.S. Navy vessels fired 36,370 anti-aircraft rounds in combat. Only 25% used proximity fuses, but those fused shells accounted for 51% of all aircraft destroyed. The night-kill ratios were even more dramatic, increasing by 370% compared to time fuses. Admiral William Halsey had been deeply concerned about Japanese torpedo bombers making nighttime attacks on his task forces. Radar could track the bombers, but hitting them in darkness with time-fused shells was nearly impossible. Proximity fuses leveled that battlefield overnight. When Japanese aircraft attacked at night, American gunners simply fired proximity fused shells toward the radar tracks. The fuses did the rest. The kamikaze attacks that began in October 1944 would have been far more devastating without proximity fuzzes. Japanese suicide pilots deliberately flew through flak, accepting damage in exchange for reaching their targets. Proximity fuses detonated around the kamikazes, shredding them before they reached the ships. But on land, the story was very different. The Pentagon refused to authorize land-based use of proximity fuses. The reasoning was sound, but led to a delay that cost thousands of lives. The fear was simple and rational. If a single proximity-fused shell landed intact on enemy territory, German or Japanese scientists could examine it, determine how it worked, and develop their own version. The Luftwaffe could then use proximity fuzzes against Allied bombers. By late 1943, the RAF and US Army Air Forces were flying hundreds of bombers into German airspace every night. German anti-aircraft defenses were already inflicting terrible casualties. If those flak batteries suddenly became 3 to 5 times more effective, bomber losses would become unsustainable. The math was brutal. During 1943, RAF Bomber Command lost approximately 5% of aircraft dispatched on major raids. A typical 1,000-bomber raid might lose 50 aircraft, 500 men dead or captured. If German flak suddenly tripled in effectiveness, those same raids might lose 150 bombers, 1,500 men per night. The entire strategic bombing campaign could collapse. So the Pentagon issued strict orders. Proximity fuses could be used only over water, where duds would sink and remain unrecoverable. The US Navy could use them freely. Army anti-aircraft batteries defending land bases could not. The restriction seemed reasonable given the stakes, but it created an impossible situation for the men actually fighting the war. By mid-1944, Germany had developed weapons that made the restriction untenable. On June 13, 1944, the first Vergeltungswaffe 1, or V1, flying bomb struck London. The weapon was a pilotless jet-powered aircraft carrying a 1-ton warhead. Launched from sites in occupied France, V1s flew at speeds approaching 400 miles per hour at altitudes between 2,000 and 3,000 feet. They were small, fast, and difficult targets for conventional anti-aircraft fire. Britain's air defences, designed to engage manned bombers flying at higher altitudes, struggled against the V1. RAF fighter pilots could intercept the flying bombs, but only during daylight and only if they spotted them in time. Anti-aircraft guns using time fuses required tremendous ammunition expenditure for each kill. During the first weeks of the V1 offensive, German launch sites sent an average of 120 flying bombs per day toward London. Anti-aircraft batteries fired thousands of shells daily, but achieved kill rates below 25%. The civilian casualties mounted rapidly. The V1 carried no guidance system. It simply flew until its fuel ran out, then dove into whatever lay below. Residential neighbourhoods, hospitals, schools, all were potential impact points. By late June, thousands of civilians had been killed. Tens of thousands were wounded. The weapon's psychological effect was devastating. Unlike conventional bombing raids, which gave warning and ended, after a few hours, V1s arrived constantly, day and night, in ones and twos. There was no pattern, no way to predict when or where the next impact would occur. Winston Churchill authorized the use of proximity fuses against the V-1 threat. Section T at Johns Hopkins rapidly modified existing fuse designs to work against the flying bomb's unique characteristics. The V-1 flew low and fast. Standard anti-aircraft fuses designed for high-altitude work had to be recalibrated. The fuzes needed to distinguish between the V-1 and ground returns, the radar echoes reflecting from the Earth itself. Engineers developed wave suppression circuits that filtered out ground reflections while maintaining sensitivity to airborne targets. Production proceeded at emergency pace. The Crosley Corporation in Cincinnati, Ohio, manufactured modified fuses around the clock. British 3.7-inch and American 90mm anti-aircraft guns were rushed to defensive positions along England's southern coast. The modified fuses arrived and were immediately loaded into ammunition. On July 15, 1944, British and American anti-aircraft batteries began firing proximity-fused shells at incoming V-1s. The results were immediate and spectacular. During the first week, V-1 kill rates jumped from 24% to 79%. By the end of August, anti-aircraft guns equipped with proximity fuses were destroying nearly 80% of all V-1s that entered their engagement zones. On August 28, German launch sites sent 104 flying bombs toward England. Radar tracked all of them. Anti-aircraft guns firing proximity-fused shells destroyed 68. Of the 36 that penetrated the coastal defences, RAF fighters and barrage balloons accounted for 32. Only 4 V-1s reached London that day. The weapon that was supposed to bring Britain to its knees had been effectively neutralised. German engineers, watching their V-1s fall in unprecedented numbers, suspected the British had developed some new defensive technology. They were correct, but they never determined what it was. Crashed V-1s littered the English countryside, but proximity-fuzzed shells destroyed mid-air left no intact fuses to examine. The secret held. In September 1944, Allied forces captured the port of Antwerp, Belgium. The port was crucial to Allied logistics. Supplies for the armies pushing into Germany had been travelling from Normandy beaches over increasingly long road networks. Antwerp's deep-water facilities could handle dozens of cargo ships simultaneously, dramatically shortening supply lines. Germany recognised Antwerp's strategic value. V-1 launch sites shifted their aim. Beginning in October, hundreds of flying bombs targeted the Belgian port. The British 11th Armoured Division defending Antwerp needed proximity fuzzes immediately. None were available in Europe. Churchill personally authorized a special airlift. Lancaster bombers flew from England to Cincinnati, loaded proximity fuses manufactured that day, and returned to Europe. The fuses went straight from the factory to anti-aircraft batteries around Antwerp. One battery, encountering V-1s for the first time, destroyed 48 of the first 75 flying bombs they engaged. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. The V-1 crisis had demonstrated proximity fuse effectiveness beyond question. By late 1944, stockpiles of fuzzed ammunition existed throughout the European theatre of operations. 90mm, 105mm, 155mm, 8-inch, and 240mm shells, all equipped with proximity fuses, sat in ammunition dumps waiting for authorization. Artillery officers and anti-aircraft commanders knew these weapons existed. They understood the tactical advantages, but the restrictions remained in force. Then came December 16, 1944, and the Ardennes offensive. The Battle of the Bulge was Germany's last major attack in the West, a desperate gamble to split Allied armies and recapture Antwerp. 3 German armies, 28 divisions, more than 400,000 men, smashed into lightly held American positions in Belgium and Luxembourg. The attack came during the worst winter weather in decades. Heavy snow, dense fog, and low clouds grounded Allied aircraft. German commanders chose the timing precisely because weather would neutralize Allied air superiority. The offensive's first hours were catastrophic for American forces. German armor broke through thinly stretched defensive lines. Entire units were surrounded and destroyed. Roads became clogged with retreating soldiers and vehicles. Communications broke down. In some sectors, American troops had no idea where the German forces were or how far they'd advanced. Colonel George Axelson's decision to use proximity fuses without authorization at Monschau was repeated across the front. Artillery officers facing German attacks used the fused ammunition because American soldiers were dying and nothing else was working. General Dwight Eisenhower, watching the offensive unfold, immediately requested authorization to use proximity fuses without restriction. On December 19th, 3 days after the attack began, the Pentagon removed all limitations. Every artillery piece in the European theatre of operations could fire proximity-fused shells. The effect on German forces was devastating. Time-fused artillery shells explode when they hit the ground. Soldiers caught in artillery fire can take cover in foxholes, behind walls, in building basements. The explosion's force directs downward and outward from the impact point. Men in even shallow depressions have decent survival chances, but proximity-fuzzed shells detonate 30 to 50 feet in the air. The explosion spreads shrapnel downward in a cone pattern. Foxholes provide no protection, neither do walls or buildings. The shrapnel falls from above. Soldiers caught in proximity-fused artillery barrages have nowhere to hide. German infantry, advancing through the Ardennes forests and across snow-covered fields, suddenly found themselves under artillery fire unlike anything they'd experienced. American forward observers, using radio-equipped Sherman tanks as mobile command posts, called in fire missions on German troop concentrations. American 105mm and 155mm howitzers responded with proximity-fused shells. The rounds detonated above German positions, raining metal fragments on troops who thought they'd taken cover. General George Patton's Third Army, fighting to relieve surrounded American forces at Bastogne, used proximity-fused artillery with devastating effectiveness. On December 22nd, forward observers spotted a German battalion attempting to cross the Sauer River. Patton's artillery fired a battalion concentration, multiple batteries firing simultaneously on the same target. The proximity-fused shells arrived within seconds of each other, creating a steel rain over the crossing site. American observers counted 702 dead German soldiers after the barrage. Patton later wrote to the Army Ordnance Department that the funny fuse, as he called it, had won the Battle of the Bulge. German soldiers captured during the battle spoke repeatedly about the demoralizing effect of the air-bursting shells. Prisoners told interrogators they'd felt safe in foxholes during previous battles. Artillery fire, while frightening, could be survived by staying low and waiting for it to end. But these new shells exploded overhead. There was no defense. Some German units refused orders to advance through areas being hit by American artillery. Officers reported minor mutinies as soldiers declined to leave their bunkers during barrages. The proximity fuse also proved devastatingly effective against German aircraft. The Luftwaffe launched major air attacks in support of the Ardennes offensive, committing hundreds of fighters and ground attack aircraft. These attacks marked the Luftwaffe's last large-scale daylight operations over Western Europe. Allied anti-aircraft batteries, now firing proximity-fused ammunition without restriction, slaughtered German aircraft. Statistics from the Battle of the Bulge period tell the story. From December 16, 1944, through January 25, 1945, Allied anti-aircraft artillery using proximity fuses destroyed 417 German aircraft. This occurred during a period when the Luftwaffe was already critically short of experienced pilots and fuel. The German aircraft shot down over the Ardennes included fighters, bombers, and ground attack aircraft. Among them were Messerschmitt Bf-109s, Focke-Wulf 190 fighters, and Junkers Ju-88 bombers. The Junkers Ju-87 Stuka, Germany's famous dive bomber with its inverted gull wings and screaming sirens, was largely absent from this slaughter. By late 1944, the Stuka had been relegated to night harassment missions and anti-tank operations on the Eastern Front. The aircraft that had terrorized Poland, France, and the Low Countries in 1940 and 41 had proven too slow and vulnerable once Allied fighters achieved air superiority. The Focke-Wulf 190 had replaced the Stuka in the ground attack role by 1943. Those 190s flying over the Ardennes in December 1944 encountered American 90mm anti-aircraft guns firing proximity-fused shells. The guns could fire 20 to 25 rounds per minute. Each shell, when fired at aircraft, was set to detonate when its fuse detected a target within 75 yards. Gunners didn't need direct hits. They needed to get shells into the general vicinity of enemy aircraft. The fuses did the rest. A German fighter flying at 300 miles per hour covered 440 feet per second. A 90mm shell travelled at 2,700 feet per second. The combination of high shell velocity and proximity detonation gave German pilots almost no time to evade. Luftwaffe tactical reports from January 1945, captured after the war, describe losses to flak as unsustainable. German air commanders noted that anti-aircraft fire seemed suddenly and dramatically more effective. Pilots reported shells exploding around their aircraft even when they maneuvered violently. The pattern didn't match previous experience with time-fused flak, which typically exploded in predetermined boxes that pilots could avoid. These new explosions seemed to follow the aircraft. They were, of course, detecting the aircraft and detonating when near them. But German pilots and commanders never fully understood what they were facing. Some reports speculated about radar-guided shells, which was partially correct. Others suggested acoustic detection. The actual mechanism remained a mystery to Germany throughout the war. German scientists had, in fact, captured intact proximity fuses. On July 15, 1943, during the invasion of Sicily, US Navy ships fired proximity-fused 5-inch shells at German positions. Several duds landed on Sicilian beaches. German troops recovered them and sent them to technical intelligence for analysis. The fuses reached German research facilities within weeks. Engineers examined the captured fuses in detail. They identified the miniature vacuum tubes, the battery design, the transmitter and receiver circuits. They understood the operating principle completely, but they reached a crucial conclusion. The Americans couldn't possibly be manufacturing these in quantity. The precision required, the miniaturization, the ruggedization for surviving gun firing, all suggested these were experimental prototypes or hand-built devices for special applications. German electronics production, stressed by bombing and material shortages, couldn't duplicate the American achievement. Sylvania's miniature vacuum tubes alone represented manufacturing capabilities Germany didn't possess. The reserve battery design was brilliant but required resources Germany couldn't spare. Most importantly, making millions of these fuses required industrial capacity and coordination beyond Germany's capability in 1944. So German scientists wrote reports describing the captured fuses as interesting but not operationally significant. They recommended continued work on acoustic and electrostatic proximity fuse designs, which seemed more achievable with German resources. Those programs proceeded at low priority throughout 1944 and into 1945. None reached production before Germany surrendered. The irony is profound. Germany possessed the theoretical knowledge to build proximity fuses by late 1943. They'd captured working examples. They understood the threat these weapons posed. But they convinced themselves that mass production was impossible, that the Americans couldn't be using these weapons in quantity, that conventional anti-aircraft methods remained viable. That assumption cost them the Battle of the Bulge's air component. It cost them hundreds of aircraft and experienced pilots they couldn't replace. It cost them any remaining ability to contest Allied air superiority over Western Europe. By January 1945, the Allied advance into Germany resumed. Proximity fuzzes became standard ammunition for all calibers of American artillery. British forces also received proximity fuzzed shells for their guns. From January through May 1945, as Allied armies crossed the Rhine and drove into the German heartland, proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire destroyed more than 1,000 Luftwaffe aircraft. This occurred during a period when the Luftwaffe had already been reduced to a shadow of its former strength, when fuel shortages grounded most aircraft, when Germany's most experienced pilots were dead or captured. The few remaining Luftwaffe units attempting to defend German cities and military installations found themselves facing an impossible tactical situation. They couldn't fly high because Allied fighters controlled the air at altitude. They couldn't fly low because proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire made low-altitude attack runs suicidal. German ground attack aircraft, the Focke-Wulf 190s and remaining Ju-87s operating at night, suffered terrible casualties whenever they encountered American or British anti-aircraft positions. The Ju-87, that symbol of German blitzkrieg, ended the war as a night harassment aircraft flying the Eastern Front against Soviet forces. The screaming dive bomber that had terrorized Europe in 1940 could barely survive in 1945's aerial combat environment. Its fixed landing gear created excessive drag. Its maximum speed of 240 miles per hour made it easy prey for Allied fighters. Its light defensive armament couldn't protect it from modern interceptors. And when proximity-fused anti-aircraft fire was added to the equation, the Stuka became obsolete beyond any possibility of useful employment. The few Stukas that did encounter proximity-fuzzed 90mm fire didn't survive to report their experience. An aircraft as slow and unmaneuverable as the Ju-87, flying through proximity-fuzzed flak, would last seconds. The shell doesn't need to hit, it just needs to get close. When it does, the fuse detects the metal aircraft and detonates. Shrapnel tears through aluminum skin, severs control cables, ruptures fuel tanks. The Stuka's rugged construction, designed to survive steep dives and rough field landings, couldn't protect it from a proximity fuse detonating at optimal range. The transformation in anti-aircraft effectiveness can be quantified. Before proximity fuzzes, destroying one aircraft required an average of 3,000 to 5,000 anti-aircraft shells. With proximity fuzzes, that number dropped to between 600 and 1,000 shells, a fivefold improvement in efficiency. But the psychological impact exceeded the statistical improvement. Pilots who flew through proximity-fused flak described it as terrifying in ways that conventional flak wasn't. Conventional time-fused flak created black clouds of explosions at predetermined altitudes. Pilots could see where the shells were bursting and maneuver to avoid those areas. Proximity-fuzzed flak seemed to pursue aircraft, with shells exploding precisely where the aircraft was flying. Pilots reported that evasive maneuvers didn't help because the shells detected and followed them. This wasn't true. The fuses simply detonated when they approached any aircraft, but the perception created psychological pressure that affected German pilot performance. By April 1945, the Luftwaffe had effectively ceased to exist as an offensive force. Fuel shortages meant most aircraft sat grounded. Those that did fly faced overwhelming Allied fighter superiority and lethally effective anti-aircraft fire. Germany's jet aircraft, the Messerschmitt Me 262, offered performance that could have challenged Allied air superiority, but too few were built, arrived too late, and suffered from engine reliability problems. Even the jets couldn't survive when proximity-fused shells filled the air around them. The cost of the delay in authorizing land-based proximity fuse use can only be estimated, but the numbers are sobering. From January 1943, when Helena achieved the first proximity fuse kill in the Pacific, until December 1944, When the Battle of the Bulge forced authorization for European land use, nearly 2 years passed. During those 2 years, RAF and American bombers flew hundreds of thousands of sorties over occupied Europe and Germany. German anti-aircraft defences shot down thousands of Allied aircraft. Statistical analysis suggests that if proximity fuses had been available to defend Allied bomber formations, or to suppress German flak positions through counter-battery fire, bomber losses might have been reduced by 20 to 30%. The actual human cost is measured in thousands of American and British airmen who died during those 2 years when a technology that could have saved them sat unused in ammunition depots because Pentagon officials feared what might happen if Germany captured one. The fear was legitimate. Had Germany developed proximity fuses earlier in the war, had they successfully reverse-engineered captured examples and put them into production, the strategic bombing campaign would have faced catastrophic losses. German 88mm and 105mm flak guns, already deadly with time fuses, would have been devastatingly effective with proximity fuses. The entire Allied air strategy might have required revision. But Germany didn't develop proximity phases. Their scientists concluded it was impossible. Their electronics industry couldn't match American production capacity. Their war economy, strained by fighting on multiple fronts, couldn't devote resources to a weapon system their experts said wouldn't work. So the delay, while costly to Allied airmen, didn't hand Germany a war-winning technology. It simply meant that a weapon which could have saved thousands of lives sat unused while men died. The proximity fuse transformed from closely guarded secret to standard ammunition in less than a month during December 1944 and January 1945. Once the restrictions lifted, American and British forces used proximity-fused shells without restraint. Artillery batteries fired them against German troop concentrations. Anti-aircraft guns fired them against Luftwaffe aircraft. The weapons proved so effective that doctrinal changes became necessary. Pre-war artillery doctrine assumed shells would detonate on impact. Tactics focused on achieving accuracy and proper trajectory. With proximity fuses, accuracy requirements decreased because the shells exploded at optimal height automatically. Artillerymen discovered they could achieve devastating effects on troop concentrations without precisely ranging the target. Set the fuse for airburst, bracket the target area with multiple rounds, and let the fuses handle the rest. Anti-aircraft doctrine changed even more dramatically. Before proximity fuses, anti-aircraft batteries positioned guns to create boxes of exploding shells that enemy aircraft had to fly through. Gunners calculated altitude, set time fuses accordingly, and hoped aircraft would be at that altitude when shells exploded. Success required elaborate fire control equipment and precise calculations. Proximity fuses simplified everything. Point the gun at the aircraft. Fire. The shell detects the target and explodes at optimal range. Success rates increased dramatically, even without sophisticated fire control. This meant smaller, more mobile anti-aircraft units could provide effective defense. It meant anti-aircraft batteries could engage aircraft at any altitude without resetting fuses between shots. It meant rapid-fire guns like the 90mm, already capable of 20 rounds per minute, became even more lethal because every shell had a better chance of destroying its target. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe. The post-war analysis of proximity fuse effectiveness revealed numbers that validated the enormous investment. Over 22 million fuses were manufactured during the war, at a cost exceeding $1 billion 1940s dollars. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal stated that the proximity fuse helped blaze the trail to Japan, that without it the Pacific advance would have cost immeasurably more in men and ships. Winston Churchill called the fuzes potent against the V-1 flying bombs that assailed Britain. George Patton credited them with winning the Battle of the Bulge. General Eisenhower offered perhaps the most telling assessment. He stated that if Germany had perfected and deployed proximity fuzzes 6 months earlier than they did, or rather 6 months earlier than the Allies did, the invasion of Europe would have proven exceedingly difficult, perhaps impossible. Coming from the Supreme Allied Commander, the man who planned and executed D-Day and the subsequent campaign across Western Europe, that statement carries profound weight. The technology didn't end with World War II. Proximity. Fuses became standard equipment for anti-aircraft missiles, artillery shells, and aerial bombs throughout the Cold War. Modern versions use laser or radar ranging instead of vacuum tubes and reserve batteries, but the fundamental principle remains unchanged. Detect the target, detonate at optimal range. The Phoenix AIM-54 air-to-air missile, the standard surface-to-air missiles, the Patriot missile system that defended against Iraqi Scud missiles during the 1991 Gulf War, all descend directly from the proximity fuse technology developed at Johns Hopkins in 1940 through 42. The German expectation, or rather their lack of expectation, that proximity fuses would make Allied anti-aircraft weapons dramatically more effective, stemmed from their own scientists' conclusions that such weapons couldn't be mass-produced. They were wrong. American industrial capacity, American electronics manufacturing, and American scientific ingenuity produced a weapon that German and Japanese scientists dismissed as theoretical. That weapon transformed anti-aircraft warfare, saved thousands of Allied lives, and contributed substantially to Allied victory. The Ju-87 Stuka, symbol of German air power in the war's early years, never faced American 90mm guns equipped with proximity fuses in significant numbers because by the time those weapons entered European service, the Stuka was already obsolete and withdrawn from Western combat zones. But the few that did encounter proximity-fused fire, the Focke-Wulf 190s that replaced them, the Messerschmitt fighters attempting to defend German cities, all faced a technology their side had concluded was impossible to build. That assumption, that failure to recognize what American industry could achieve, cost Germany dearly in the war's final months. The proximity fuse stands as proof that wars are won not just by courage and tactics, but by industrial capacity, scientific ingenuity, and the ability to turn theoretical concepts into millions of functional weapons. Germany understood the theory, they captured the examples, but they couldn't match the production, and that made all the difference.